Across the pages of covenant history, few moments are as weighty and wondrous as God's covenant with ancient Israel in TableTalk Magazine, rooted in Exodus chapter 20, verses 1 and 2. Here we see the Lord not as a distant lawgiver, but as the Redeemer who first rescues his people from bondage and then calls them to walk in his ways. It is a reminder that grace precedes command, that redemption sings before obedience follows. Now for our reading. And God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Exodus chapter 20, verses 1 and 2. Continuing our look at the various covenants of the Bible, we come today to God's covenant with ancient Israel, more commonly known as the Mosaic covenant. How this covenant relates to the covenant of grace has been the subject of no small controversy over the years. One recurring question has been whether the Mosaic covenant actually is part of the covenant of grace. Today we will emphasize that the Mosaic covenant is an administration of the covenant of grace and not the covenant of works. Throughout church history, some have said that under the Old Covenant, people were saved by their good works of obedience to the law, but that under the New Covenant, we are saved by grace. On a popular level, this view seems to be widely held even today. It becomes clear, however, that the Mosaic covenant is part of the covenant of grace when we consider its basis, the timing of Israel's receiving its laws, and its regulations for worship. First, the Mosaic covenant is grounded in the gracious promise of God to the patriarchs of Israel and in his redemption of the Israelites from Egyptian slavery. Exodus 2, 23-25 tells us that the Lord acted to save Israel from Egypt because of the covenant he made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The Lord graciously imposed that covenant, and in ratifying it God confirmed that he himself, not human beings, would ensure its fulfillment. The birth of Isaac to a barren woman was also a sign that salvation is by God's grace and not the works of sinners, because man could not open Sarah's womb. Second, the timing of God's giving the law of the Mosaic covenant also demonstrates that this covenant falls under the covenant of grace. We see this in today's passage, which establishes the giving of the 10 Commandments in God's gracious salvation. Exodus 21-2 introduces the 10 Commandments with a reminder that the Lord brought Israel out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Only after that reminder does God give the commandments. This preface reminds us that redemption preceded the giving of the law. God did not give the law so that people could save themselves by it. He gave the law to a people whom he had already saved. Finally, Old Covenant worship regulations show the graciousness of the Mosaic covenant. God gave its sacrificial system to atone for the people's sins and mediate his forgiveness. This was pure grace, for the Lord owes no one a pardon for transgressions. In every era, God has related to his people by grace. His salvation is established, sustained, and completed by grace. If we think that this was not true under the Old Covenant, then we have ultimately said that God changes his mind about what he requires for redemption. Even the Old Covenant saints were saved by grace alone, and we must maintain this truth. This concludes our reading. Thank you for listening.